Live back at it again. It's the State of Football, Part 87 edition here on December 1st. Welcome to December, 1 month away from ending this 2020 nightmare on Elm Street here. Of course, broadcasting live on Philadelphia Avenue at the Jersey Shore here in good old Lavallette, New Jersey. I am one part of the equation here today on Tuesday. Rick Serritella, telling it like it is when it comes to the NFL draft, everything football. Of course, my co-host John Murphy down in New Orleans, VP of Player Personnel, with me every day of the week. And every Tuesday, if you don't know, now you know, we're lucky to have Russ Lande at Russ Lande on Twitter. He's a must follow. Make sure you go check him out. Of course, U.S. Scouting for Calgary Stampeders, Infectious Scouting, the football GM and scouting course on Sports Management Worldwide. We just had a scouting call last night. It's very cool to see how many guys were in the Zoom room last night that took Russell Lande's football GM and scouting course. We've got a handful of people now working with us here at the NFL Draft Bible. And so we say good morning, Russ. It's been a whole week since we've seen you. How are you today?
Life is good, man. It's a beautiful day. It's only going to be about 35 degrees here in Chicago, but it's not raining. It's not snowing, so it's good. And football's going on, so life is good.
Yeah, we miss you here at the Jersey Shore. It's another beach day here. So we're getting it in, baby.
Hey, the beach only gives you an excuse to not work, just to get out of the house.
I gotta take you up on that one and try to utilize that philosophy. But we are getting it in as best we can, and the Eagles got it in the backdoor cover with the Hail Mary miracle. Bringing it within 6. So John and I both picking up the W there with the Seahawks winning, the Eagles covering. We'll try to dive into a little bit of that, but the Eagles now in first place there. Of course, we're talking about front office shakeups. If we have time, we'll try to dive into that as well. But we tend to focus on the college football action every Tuesday. We look back at some prospects that surprised us. We look ahead to some marquee matchups that we'll be keeping an eye on, try to bring you some names under the radar, some of the latest underclassmen who declared, and of course, the Senior Bowl invites continue to roll out there. So we'll kind of cover it all there. Let's start off though with the Scouting the Nation, by the way, is up on the NFLDraftBible.com. If you didn't check that out, we have all your news and notes from our scouting notebook this past weekend. But John Murphy, started off with you. Who are a player or some players that stood out to you this past weekend?
Well, I think it's the factor that, once those games ended and you see LSU will now go into back-to-back games against Alabama and Florida without their best offensive weapon, Terrence Marshall opting out. Iowa State, sneaks by. Texas, Caleb Stern, opts out. This is kind of what we have been, kind of leaning toward, kind of intimating could happen here down the stretch. Once your team, kind of is not playing for what they were originally playing for, how many of these kids are going to get leaned on, by the system, or on their own to say, hey, the best laid plans is, to look toward the future in the NFL, and you're starting to see that happen, in those two instances. And it really makes you wonder how many of these bowl games outside of the ones that will decide the national championship are going to feature the name brand players. And to me, that's a big speculation, but, we've seen it happen little by little here. Rashad Bateman did it. Now here we are the following week, and we got 2 more guys with real names, going on there on the field. You had a Jarrett Patterson. What's next? 40 carries for 500 yards and 10 touchdowns.
Man, and he had that record, by the way. I don't know if you were watching that game, but he needed 42 yards. They're on the 43-yard line, and all they had to do was just run the ball into the end zone, and he would have set the all-time single-game rushing record. I think Samaje Perine had 437. So I'm watching the game, and they're on the 43-yard line. They pick up the first down. There's literally like 30 yards to go. All they got to do is run it into the end zone. The coach takes them out. Like, the coach didn't know, and he takes him out, and he's congratulating. And, like, nobody told Coach, Coach, he's got a chance to set the single-game record. The very next play, like 1 or 2 plays. I think the very next play they hand it to the backup, Kevin Marks, and he runs it 30 yards for a touchdown. You robbed us! You robbed us, coach.
Well, and both, because 9 touchdowns would have been a record too.
Yeah.
So he's got to make do with the factor that he's got about 730 yards rushing in the last 2 games.
Unbelievable.
And the thing is that, we mentioned that was a battle of undefeated. So of what there is against them in the MAC. So, there may be another opportunity before it's over for Jarrett Patterson to get another 300 or 400 yard game. Amazing thing is, so they're 4-0, and he's getting 1,000 yards this week. He's hitting 1,000 yards the next game he plays.
Yeah,
he got 700, the last 2, and had 200 the week before. So he's on the verge of 1,000 after 4 games. And I think he's an interesting kid because he's not built like an every down back, but he's not an all-purpose, guy. He's just a really good running back, and I think, when you look at him and the Herbert kid who's kind of gotten dinged, that hamstring has kind of killed his season there. Those are 2 guys that they may not run the best 40s, right? They don't have the best height, the best body types, but boy, they kind of have that Ray Rice, like little bowling ball, kind of thing where nobody really gets a big shot on them, and they get better, on carries 15 to 20 in Herbert's, case, and Patterson gets better on carries 25, 35, like he's kind of that old school, if he was at Wisconsin, this kid would be winning the Heisman, right? Like, I mean, that's what he is. Like, he looks like those kind of Big Ten backs that just took it 30 times a game for 250 a week. And so glad that he's getting some national attention this week for the job he did. You also got to give kudos. Their O-line graded out as well as any O-line in the country, this week. So kind of underrated, we know who they are, in terms of the program is really, ascended to the spot that they're in. And I think they have an excellent opportunity to run the table, win that conference. And then we'll see how high, he goes. Is he even the highest, drafted player off his own team? But I think, there'd be a lot of NFL teams, kind of licking their chops to get your hands on a kid like him or Herbert, wherever you're going to get him in the draft.
No doubt.
You're going to get a super productive back in the NFL for a very reasonable rookie price tag.
Yeah, and it's good that he got these games in because he kind of was like the forgotten man, right? And now he's like, hey, remember me? And the broadcast announcer, he made a good point. Like, you're watching Patterson run into the end zone with the ball high and tight, and it's like the ball looks too big for his body. Like, he's that tiny. Like, the ball, like, just it looks like he's just struggling to hold on to that thing. And then you blink and he's 50 yards down the field again and again and again and again. So Jarrett Patterson, somebody that we've been kind of on since his first game as a freshman. I remember watching this kid. I actually texted our friend Ted Gavai because I know he's always right across the border from Buffalo attending a lot of those games. I said, yo, this kid Patterson's legit. He said, yep. The state of football here, Rick Serritella, John Murphy, Russell Lande. Russ, before we dive into players who stood out to you, you heard John mention a wave of, underclassmen now beginning to declare. He mentioned Caden Stearns, the safety, also the tackle at Texas, Samuel Cosme. A lot of people think he'll be the second tackle off the board. Rashad Wild Goose from South Carolina, who only played 2 games, tested positive for COVID, left his last game against Northwestern with the shoulder injury, but the 2 games he played, pretty impressive stuff. He says, hey, I'm out of here. And then Asante Samuel Jr., who really it looks like his dad, especially when he intercepts the ball going the other way with the ball in his hands. He had a handful of interceptions this year. I think he caused a couple forced fumbles, had a fumble recovery. So Asante Samuel Jr., I think he's kind of in contention, not a round 1 guy in my book because he's probably an inside slot guy. But I think, at the top part of the second round, he could be, maybe the first slot corner off the board. But would you agree with the assessment, the initial statement that John made? I think we're about to see an avalanche of people coming out for the draft now.
Well, I think there's no question, especially I think you're going to see it amongst the schools that aren't in competition to win their conferences. I think some of those kids that really want to see a conference championship, they're going to stick around for those few schools. But I think the rest of them are going to say, hey, why am I going to, A, stay here, put myself at risk playing games, or B, why am I going to be on campus? Why am I going to risk all the stuff that's going on? A lot of schools aren't even having in-person classes. Why should I be roaming around campus taking care of football? Why don't I get out of here and go train it, whether it's at home or wherever it may be, and be safer? So I think there's no doubt you're going to see a ton more, especially from the teams that aren't in the Power Five and those teams in the Power Five that are no longer in contention for their conference championships.
Yeah, and you look at LSU. I mean, they're now 3-4. The way they're going, they may not even be in a bowl game, right? I mean, they might get a pity invite. But I mean, if you're a top guy like Terrence Marshall there, I mean, like to your point, why stick around for what?
Yeah, if this is a normal year where being on campus is not a major risk and it's only the injury, then I think most kids aren't going to drop out because of that. They want to finish that year. I think most of these kids, they're there because they love football in addition to wanting to play professionally. But I think the COVID adds a whole nother factor to this, and kids are like, hey, we have 2 games left. My team's not very good. What is the reason for me to continue in this and put myself at risk every single day?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think 25 years ago, it would have been frowned upon a little bit down more. But, at this point, this is such a big business of football. Who could blame them? They've got to put themselves first and foremost, just like these college football programs put themselves first and foremost. These head coaches, I hate to say it, no secret, they're not putting the players back.
The coaches aren't. I think the big debate's going to be, it's not so much that they're doing this. There have been players who skipped their bowl games that didn't affect their status. And we talked about this at the beginning of the year with that LSU nose tackle. So it's the beginning of December. You have 3 months, if you're fortunate enough, like Asante Samuel or the Kosi kid from Texas, before you, quote unquote, should be at the NFL Combine, which hopefully that takes place as we expect it to. Do they show up in shape? That's the real question. Yeah. Like I look at that nose tackle from LSU who's playing in the 360s. I would be floored if he shows up in shape. Nose tackles are not known as guys who do a good job of watching their weight and doing all those things. Usually being around the team helps them. So let's see how he does when he shows up. Is Kosi going to show up in shape? But that's the big debate for all these kids that are leaving now, is not so much that they're leaving now early. Just any kid who leaves early, you better show up in shape at the combine.
Well, Shelvin's a big one because I think, John, if I'm not mistaken, he was up to like 380 at one point in his career.
Yeah, and that was, like Russ said, the biggest thing that helped him was being around the team. And then, once Orgeron and his guys, were fully, in charge, just kind of them, corralling that kid and showing him the way that, he was going to need to get in shape, not only to think about the NFL, but in order to play and be successful there at LSU. And, he had lost, over 40 pounds, and played well, last year. So, again, I think we're going to see an inordinate number of kids getting evaluated. It'll be interesting to see, if they all get their grades back. It's sort of that thing of, you have 8 juniors at the same position, all put in for their grade. Are you giving them an individual grade? That's great. But is somebody breaking that down for those kids to say, like, hey, if 4 of you all got 3rd round grades, you're all not going in the 3rd round, so that'll be an interesting, scenario. And then on the backside of it will be, does the NCAA and the NFL reasonably decide that come the spring or come the draft, if you want to opt out, is there an opt-out date that says, okay, you got to miss game 1 of next year, right? Or you got to do something more along the lines of what they've done with NCAA basketball, to say these kids are going to make a hasty decision, likely off of a lot of immaturity and emotion. And then if you're not going to the combine, we already know that the pro day thing should look like last year. Hopefully it's better, right? Hopefully by then everybody's getting their vaccine or similar and we're back to, something more normal. But if not, you're going to have a whole nother group of kids that are going to go undrafted not have a real shot, and then if they don't have an opportunity to go back to school, you're going to have a lot of sad stories. So I think both sides need to have a little more, kind of grow our faith in the system here. That what you just said about the coaches, that standard is not set across the board from the NCAA and the NFL, because there's a lot of kids that sometimes need to get some guidance, and sometimes you got to let them go through it, right? You let them make a mistake to learn from it, but let's not have that mistake be, that they're not able to finish their college degrees, that we're not allowing them back on campus, and kind of have a little bit of more smarts, to how we operate here. Now, we saw a little bit of it with allowing Rashad Bateman and Rondell Moore and some of those guys that had some interactions with agents back into the season this year. That would be a really smart idea on both sides, to say, don't make it a slam dunk that once these kids enter, that they have to remain in the draft. And number two, if they go undrafted, give them an option to come back, even if it is missing one game, right? Even if it's something that you have to do in order to not make this, be, something that gets utilized in the future, as such. But I think it's a dangerous course of action to see the number of kids that are probably going to follow suit here because they think, oh, well, other guys are doing it. Like, hey, I could get drafted now and not wait another season. It's a dangerous course of action, I think, what we could see, in the next 6 to 8 weeks.
Well, hopefully the NCAA steps up and takes some leadership. Imagine that, and has some kind of uniform announcement, because, I hate these kind of case-by-case exception rules that we see, and we never get like a reasonable explanation, like why player X is allowed to come back, but player Y can't, and player Z is just waiting for weeks and weeks and weeks to get an answer. And also, too, like these guys declaring, I don't know if they even submitted paperwork to the advisory board. I know that they have not received feedback at this stage of the game. So these guys are making blinded decisions. And also the NFL needs to step their game up too with the advisory committee, because each team technically is allowed to submit up to 5 players to get evaluated to the advisory board. Now, they were making exceptions to the rule for the Alabamas and Clemsons and guys with slew of underclassmen talent. But, I just don't understand how the NFL advisory board is going to reasonably get back to all these guys looking for feedback, giving them an accurate grade. And that's why you should hit us up at NFLDraftBible.com. We can help you out there with that if you want. RIC at NFLDraftBible.com. Of course, we've got 2 of the best evaluators in the game, John Murphy, the Toronto Argonauts VP of Player Personnel, Russ Lande, Calgary Stampeders, U.S. Scouting, of course, longtime scout in the NFL, CFL, XFL, Rams, Browns. The list goes on, and we're lucky to have him here every Tuesday. Russell, we didn't get your guys, any players that stood out to you from this past weekend's action. Give us some names here. I've got my pen and pencil ready.
Yeah. Well, firstly, the one thing I will add to the conversation we were just having is, if the NFL wants to make this better for the kids who are either are opting out now but haven't declared for the NFL draft, officially submitted the paperwork, which I would bet is most of them. Most of them haven't actually filled that paperwork out, or kids that are opting out just because they're opting out, and then they're going to decide if they're going to return next year. Maybe what the NFL needs to do is come up with a way to present a list in the first week of January or second week of January. Here are the invites for the combine. Here's every underclassman who's being invited. Because then I think kids might say, you know what? If I've opted out and I'm not getting invited to the combine, maybe that's sort of a sign that there's a good chance I'm not getting an opportunity. I ought to head back to school. I ought to take advantage, because that's a big. We know if you don't go to the combine, your odds of getting drafted are very low. So
I think 20 guys last year. 20
exactly.
maybe.
So it's like, do you really want to bet on your future on that when you could go back, get your degree, spend another year at school, improve as a player? I think all of those reasons. It'd be great if the NFL and the NCAA could work together. Even if it's an unofficial thing behind the scenes, the NFL gives a list. Hey, here's the kids from every school. And even if you only send it to that school, here are the only underclassmen we would consider from your school. And boom, that way you can tell these kids, hey, you're making a big mistake doing this. In terms of guys who stood out to me, it's funny. I'm watching Big Ten like I always do, watching Northwestern lay an egg against Michigan State. Really disappointing because I think Coach Fitzgerald there at Northwestern is literally not only one of the best coaches, but one of the best people in this business. He cares about his kids. He genuinely puts their interests very highly, which I think is uncommon for many college coaches. So all year I've been talking about Patty Fisher, wanting to watch their guard who's so good. And all of a sudden, the linebacker who lines up next to Patty Fisher,
Gallagher,
he plays the game of his life against Michigan State. Now, given he looks a little bit stiff and a little bit upright when he's running, and I don't know if this is a guy you want to put out there in coverage and say, get on Travis Kelce or the Pitts kid when he comes from Florida. But in terms of running to the ball, having speed, being able to stay under control and make tackles and hard hits out in space, this kid to me jumps out as a guy that, hey, he may never be a starter in the NFL, but he can be a role player, and I'll bet you he'll be a very good short yardage linebacker and an excellent special teams player. And that's without studying him. That's just from watching the TV game. And the other game last week, I said, hey, I couldn't wait to watch Purdy of Iowa State go against Texas. You know, within probably 10 minutes, I'd already forgotten about Purdy. It wasn't that he wasn't playing well. I thought he did a good job. But he's thrown to this kid, and I know I'm going to screw his name, but Dylan Sainer, I think is how they're pronouncing it, this big 6'7" tight end. I mean, you talk about a kid who's, they say he's 6'7", 270. He runs pretty well. He kept getting hurt during the game, going out, coming back in, making great catches. Never going to remind you of a guy that's going to be a Dominic Gronkowski type blocker because he is so long and linear. But you talk about a kid that knows at least to get in the way, gives a good effort, and wow, does he have the range in terms of length, hand use, catching radius to make some tough catches. He really impressed me in terms of the overall package. Haven't really studied him on film yet, but he jumped out at me as a guy, hey, worst case scenario, you're talking a backup tight end in the NFL. Possibly the more film I watch, see a little bit more, get a little bit better feel for his athleticism. This guy might be a guy that's sort of a third to fourth round guy as a possible future starter. But I got to see more film before I stamp that third or fourth round grade. But he really caught my eye as an intriguing option.
Yeah, Iowa State's been producing these tree trunk tight ends. These just mammoth guys, big body guys. So you mentioned the Northwestern linebackers, and I'm not sure if Patty Fisher or Blake Gallagher actually gets drafted. But to your point, once you get them into a camp, you know they're going to be
time getting rid of them.
Yeah,
there's no question.
And you know they're going to be well coached, and they just swarm to the football, right?
They do. It's amazing.
So I mean, two guys there. You know, one guy who I had a chance to see last year live, and you know, I went and saw the UCF football team. I forgot who they were playing, and they had Dylan Gabriel, who's drafted. He's playing for the Bills now, and they've got the receivers this year that you hear about, Marlon Williams, who just recently opted out, Trey Nixon, another guy there. But this Jacob Harris, like when I saw him last year, I said, man, this guy's got a really good frame. You know, I go and do some background on him. Like his production is kind of streaky. Like you look and you do the box score scouting, and you see like he makes a few catches here and there, and they're like big chunks. And so like I'm at the game and he makes like maybe 2 or 3 catches, and they're both for like 30, 40 yards each. And I said, man, this guy, you know, there's something to him. He's got some juice to him. And so, you know, here we are this year, and all the other two guys are getting all the hype. And very quietly, he's had about like 3 or 4 games now of going over 100 yards. This past week, he had a $144, I think, for 3 touchdowns. And he actually reminds me of a guy that I had at the College Gridiron Showcase 5 years ago, the Jacob Hollister kid out of Wyoming.
Yeah.
And
he was playing last night, wasn't he?
I think he was, yes, indeed. And so, you know, he coming out of Wyoming, he had the same frame, wide receiver type, probably too slow to survive on the boundary at the next level. So I could see, like, here's a guy, you might just stash him on your practice squad for a year or two, put 15, 20 pounds on him, and just make him a red zone kind of mismatch type of situational tight end there. And maybe you move him up in the slot and move him around. But, you know, Jacob Harris is a guy, I don't know. I don't see any kind of love around for this guy. I just wanted to recognize him because I think there's something there. I think there's something to work with. Again, he's not getting drafted, but just a lump of clay that, I'd love to bring into my training camp and just find out what I got. What is this guy? Can we move him around?
I mean, just look at Green Bay. I mean, who's the kid catching all their passes now at tight end? It's the Tanyan kid.
Yeah.
This kid wasn't a polished kid coming out, but he was a big kid like that, athletic.
And he came out a few years ago. That's
he's a 4-year battle. I think it was 2017. The Lions had him in camp. They cut him, and the Packers claimed him. And it really spent almost 2 years just developing. And that's what you look at with a lot of these athletic receivers that may not be explosive enough to stick in the NFL as receivers. Hey, can we put 15, 20 pounds, give them a year or two to develop, and maybe they can turn into a guy that we can move around and use as a guy that can create mismatches, because outside they just don't have that ability.
Yeah, that's exactly right. So, hey, Russell Lande, John Murphy, Rick Serritella going around the horn with the college football weekend that was. Let's look ahead now to the college football weekend that will be our first football weekend in December. Hard to believe 2020 is winding down. I know a lot of people are happy to see it. So here we are, John. College football season winding down, the 2020 calendar year winding down, and we're now looking to see what prospects are still playing at this stage of the season. Who you keeping an eye on this weekend?
Well, I mean, so we have MAC action. Then we got a NFL game on a Wednesday afternoon. Only in 2020 could you have that happen.
Right.
The game gets pushed back any longer, Lamar Jackson will be playing in the game. So and then Thursday night, here we go again. The Louisiana Lafayette against App State. We saw App State and the Chanticleers a couple of weeks ago. Like, here's your next battle, of these two type teams that are kind of under the radar this year, but are both top 25, have had their upset wins, and kind of this will be the game to kind of decide which one of these teams makes it to a higher level bowl game, and which one of them probably is playing right here in front of me at the New Orleans Bowl. So the winner probably gets a better bowl game. The loser might like I said, be playing in if there are the second tier games. That's probably the what this game is for. So I think that's a very interesting matchup. And then you mentioned it. Like, there's a couple of games here that, I mean, man, Alabama at LSU, with how we've seen this go. Not going to end well. Not going to end well there. I think there's a lot of teams that the interesting part will be, you almost might want that bowl game invite, not because you're making any money or anything, but because it's going to give you an extra 4 to 6 weeks with your young players.
Yeah.
And we saw it a couple of years ago, where while they were setting up, to be playing in a national championship semifinal type game, you heard the name Derek Stingley for the first time when then defensive coordinator Dave Aranda said, hey, you know who one of our best defensive players was leading up to the bowl game? This freshman to be, who was allowed to work out with us because he had already, been on campus, and had already signed his letter of intent, and such. So, I think a lot of teams not knowing how the offseason and how spring ball and everything will work, they will like nothing more than that extra 4 to 6 weeks, no matter what you're doing and no matter what kind of bowl game it is. They'll like nothing more than to just have that opportunity, to be doing that. I think you want to see Trevor Lawrence again, and just, they're getting their feet back underneath them. Obviously Pitt was not, is not going to create too much of a roadblock, for Clemson last week. But, obviously now we're kind of in that home stretch. Clemson doesn't have another game on their schedule. Notre Dame, at Syracuse, I think they'll, give a decent account of themselves. The Wake Forest thing should be interesting because they can score some points, I think, but it is a younger team. We still got that kind of collision course of Trevor Lawrence and Notre Dame, and Clemson really being the team that if you lose, you're out. 2 losses, you're out. Notre Dame, just don't get blown out. right? Don't have it be that Clemson with Trevor Lawrence is a whole different beast, and you take a 60 to whatever beat down, because then I think somebody else could get in there. But if you are now the NCAA, you got to sort of lean toward Florida, Cincinnati, even the BYU without playing another team. Because
Texas A&M beat Florida, didn't they?
They did. I get it. But after what you saw last week, if you put Texas A&M against any one of those three teams, they are getting the A-double-G kicked out of them after what you saw last week. 11 out of 34. 11 out of 34, I could do from sitting in the chair throwing to you two guys. You can't go 11 out of 34 and tell me that you need to be in the national championship contention any way, shape, or form.
Okay, but let's be real. Rick, do you think at any point in his life John could have gone 1 for 34? I mean,
I'll take that.
Let's be honest.
Maybe if he was shooting the trash can,
Yeah, exactly. Because I'm saying if he's on a football field throwing the ball, I bet 0 for 34 every single game.
He would have been out there like Kendall Hinton.
Hey, the double pass would have counted as 1.
Hey, just to give you an idea, it's funny because we talk about this, and you're talking about how whether he's good enough or not, and the guy's not throwing the ball well. To give people on the outside an idea of the difference in what a human being is and what a quarterback is. When I was at the Rams and we were nobodies, me and a bunch of people, one of our other nobodies that was a gopher was Brian Schottenheimer. And Brian Schottenheimer, you guys may or may not remember, he was the number 1 or number 2 recruit out of high school. Went to Kansas, and in his first year blew his shoulder out. Doctors said, you're never going to be able to play quarterback again. And when he was healthy, the next year he was throwing, and they said, yeah, you can't play. And they basically said, you're done here. And he went to Florida. They transferred their scholarship basically to be a coach, to learn how to coach, because he couldn't throw. Well, one day in practice, he needed to step in for us at the Rams, so I needed to warm him up. This guy with a blown-out shoulder, who they said was not good enough to even play college football, and it was literally pulling the skin off my fingers. People don't realize they don't realize how good these guys that are playing in college, whether they become NFL guys or not. You have to be so good just to be a college quarterback, and it's just something that doesn't get enough discussion.
Yeah, as John is throwing dirt on Kellen Mond's grave there.
Yeah, exactly.
In case you didn't get the 11 for 34.
Don't get me wrong, John knows that too. I'm not trying to say it about John. I'm just saying for those people listening to this,
sure.
It is a huge jump to go from high school quarterback to even college quarterback.
Well, I had no idea about the Brian Schottenheimer story there with the shoulder and everything. So I love those nuggets and tidbits of
information. I mean, Marty basically called Spurrier because they had a good relationship and said, hey, can my kid come down there on a scholarship and he'll basically be your personal quality control coach. And that's what he did. He went down there, and Brian is one of the smartest, hardest working guys you'll ever come across. And he went through practice like a player, but then he would stick around after. He'd break down film for Spurrier. He'd be involved in all the meetings. So he literally graduated college probably more advanced in terms of football knowledge than almost any coach that's ever come into the NFL as a 25-year-old, because he literally had 3 years working under an offensive genius in college.
Yeah, no, that's pretty cool stuff right there. That's what you get here on the State of Football, weekdays, 9 a.m. Eastern. Of course, your new home for real football talk in the mornings. Take advantage of our Cyber Week special, Familia 50, 50% promo for any PDF, book, seminar, product, service, you name it, you got it. Log on to NFLDraftBible.com. Support the cause. We appreciate all the disciples of the NFL Draft Bible since 2002. It's what we do. And here in 2020, only in 2020 do you get a 9-1 Liberty team at an undefeated Coastal Carolina team. ESPN College Game Day. Shout out. They'll be on location, Coastal Carolina, number 14 in the nation. I thought we were going to get a matchup of undefeateds here, but that's the kind of game that I'll be intrigued and kind of keeping my eye on there. Of course, the quarterback there at Liberty, Malik Willis, who began at Auburn. He's starting to kind of create a little bit of a buzz for himself now. He's a junior, I believe, and so we'll be keeping an eye on him. Coastal Carolina, CJ Maribel bouncing back nicely last week. The running back there, I think he had 3 scores on the day, $150 on the ground. So there's one marquee matchup I'll be keeping an eye on. Let's turn it over to Russ Lande, see who he's going to be watching this weekend in the college football universe.
2 big games, all Big Ten, because I tend to be a Big Ten guy on the weekends. I know everybody's going to want to watch Justin Fields in the Ohio State, Michigan State game, and that's great, and he's phenomenal. I can't wait to grade him. But I'm really interested to look at their linebackers, especially Tuff Borland and Pete Werner. These are guys I looked at off last year's film, and I thought they were decent, but I didn't love them. I've heard a bunch of scouts saying, hey, they've really stepped it up. They're playing much better football this year. I want to take a look because I want to see athletically where they are, because that was my big concern with both of them. Werner's the much bigger guy. He's a sort of a big, thick-bodied kid who can run. At least that's what he looked like last year. Really want to take a close look at both of those guys. There is Browning there too, but Borland and Werner are the 2 guys I've looked at closely on 19 film that I want to take a closer look at this year. The other game to me is Indiana-Wisconsin. Obviously, it's a shame Indiana's quarterback is out for the year with the ACL, but Wisconsin, their left tackle, Cole Van Lennon, to me is sort of that second-tier, sort of lesser-known offensive tackle. Not going to probably be a high draft pick, but smart kid, 3rd year as a starter this year at left tackle, 6'5" kid. So I want to take a peek at him and see where does he have a future at the NFL level. Is he going to be an exterior guy playing tackle, or is he more of an inside guy? Because a lot of the tackles from Wisconsin have slid into guard and have become good players in the NFL playing inside. So he's a guy I'm really going to take a close look at, and it'll be a good game to watch because it's going to probably be a scoring game. So Wisconsin's going to have to move the ball, get a chance to see this kid run and pass block a lot.
Yeah, Wisconsin offensive lineman, what you're going to get, again, like the Northwestern linebackers, Wisconsin offensive lineman, you're going to get a well-coached player there. You mentioned Ohio State, boy, if Sean Wade has any more of these encore performances, he's going to be looking to opt out and exit stage left very quickly here after getting burned in games against Indiana and Penn State. And now this weekend against Michigan State, we'll see if Rocky Lombardi can put one by him there with that Big Ten matchup. Okay. The state of football here again, weekdays, 9 a.m. Eastern. We appreciate you tuning in. Of course, the tailgate show is Saturdays, 10 a.m. Eastern. Let's shake it up a little bit and talk front office, put you guys on the spot a little bit here. But now we discussed this on the show yesterday. We're seeing openings around the league in Detroit. A lot of former Patriots getting fired in Atlanta. You got Thomas Dimitroff is gone. Bill O'Brien is now gone in Houston. Quinn and Patricia, they say goodbye in Detroit. And I wonder, Russ, at what point do you start to almost put that Patriots slander now? Like, everybody wanted to get a New England guy in their office or as their coach, and now you're seeing these guys are just consistently failing. It's not really a recipe for success. And I look at Atlanta. I brought this up yesterday. I've been kind of pounding the table here for my guy Raheem Morris, New Jersey product. But here's a guy, 32 years old, his first go around as a head coach, had to wait now 12 years as an assistant. And look at what he's done with the Falcons. And then you hear Josh McDaniels being rumored. And it's like, well, hey, let's look in-house here and take a look at what Raheem Morris is doing. But I'm kind of curious to, kind of pick your brain, Russ, on, not only some of these openings, the New England bias, and also who are some of the names, whether it's GM or head coaches, that you feel like should maybe get an opportunity here?
Well, firstly, to me, I think with the New England thing, I think you have to look at 2 different things. Is the people, and although Bill O'Brien gets killed, let's remember, a lot of the people that have left there have gone places and lost, like Patricia and Romeo Crennel and Charlie Weiss have not been overly successful. Bill O'Brien did win the division 4 times and went to the playoffs 4 times. So it's not like he was a complete disaster. There may have been other reasons. It wasn't just the winning there. But I think the thing you see with a Bill O'Brien and Dimitroff, who I think sort of gets thrown in with those former Patriots. But let's remember, he was there over a decade. They went to the playoffs a lot. They won a lot of games. And I think there's a parallel between O'Brien and Dimitrov, which is they didn't begin and end their jobs prior to their getting the head coach and GM jobs respectively with the Patriots. Their entire career was not spent in New England learning only one way to do it. Not that New England's way is bad, but you happen to have Bill Belichick, who's a brilliant, amazing guy doing it his way and winning with it. But if you only learn that way, a lot of time I think it's hard to go somewhere else, be in charge, and then try to adjust and learn and make changes on the fly when you've never learned another way. That's why I think Thomas was so successful. His dad was a scout for over 20 years, so he grew up in the business, worked for Detroit, worked for Cleveland for a while. Then he went to New England and was there for 4 or 5 years. So he sort of knew and understood the scouting side of things, the organizational side of things. I think the Patriots helped get him that opportunity because they were winning. But I look at Thomas and even Bill O'Brien, who won a lot in college, was a good, successful coach, as guys who they also had sort of an idea of how to do it outside of that building. When you only grow up in one building, and I'm not just saying Patriots people, I think it's awfully difficult to go somewhere else and succeed. Perfect example here in Chicago, Ryan Pace, who's a very smart guy and always treats us great when we go into the Bears and very decent to us, seems like a very nice man. He grew up in the Saints building. So he came here, and Mitch Trubisky is a very similar guy in terms of size, athleticism, and arm strength to Drew Brees. Checks off a lot of the physical boxes coming out of college. Athletic kid who can make throws on the move, fits that mold. But he sort of grew up in that New Orleans philosophy. So I just think it's one of those things where a lot of times the better guys are the guys that have moved around the league. To me, a guy like Lionel Vital, who's been around the league. He worked for Ozzie Newsome in Cleveland. Eric DeCosta was sort of, they were on the same level there for many years, sort of the right-hand man to Ozzie. He worked for Bill Belichick, for Bill Parcells. He's been all over. He worked for Thomas Dimitrov. So someone like that, or someone like Dave Rosano, who's worked for guys like Dick Vermeil, Charlie Army, worked at the Colts, worked at the Raiders now. Someone like that that's been around, has seen, and I should say with Rosano, his dad also happened to be the GM of the Niners under Bill Walsh. So, I mean, when you have people that are experienced and been exposed to different systems, those are the places I like to pick from. I'm very hesitant about guys who have only been in one building. Not that they're not smart enough and won't work hard, but the concern to me becomes is, have they been exposed to a lot of different things? Because when you're running a team, it doesn't all just go right down the line. Okay, this happens, this happens. Things go sideways. Guys get hurt. Guys get drugged. This year, guys get COVID. Colleges close. Your coaches leave. There's so many things. And if you can't adjust the way you're doing things, you're going to have a lot of trouble. And that's one of the reasons I think guys like that. That's why I thought Chris Ballard was such a good hire for the Colts. He had been with the Bears for a long time, then with the Chiefs. So he saw different ways of doing it. He was a college coach for a long time. So those are just, to me, my philosophy is I would want to go get guys that have been with different organizations. I mean, there are a lot of smart guys in this business, but that to me would be the big things, guys that have seen different ways that things are done.
No, some valid points. Great stuff there out of Russ Lande. And you look at that Detroit regime and maybe two guys that weren't kind of diverse.
Exactly.
Right. And now, John, you're seeing some of the comments trickling out of Detroit, basically saying in so many words, like Matt Patricia came in here acting as if he was Bill Belichick. And you know what? Like, if you've got the resume like Billy Boy, well, then, hey, you can cuss us out and scream at us like we're children all you want. But you don't have that cachet, brother. And the players in the locker room are kind of looking around like, why are you talking to me like this? And, you just kind of hear now just the style. Patricia never connected with his players. He never went over that locker room. And I think it translated onto the football field. Quite honestly, John, I think the only place for him to go back logically is to New England.
Yeah, I think the other thing that's there is if you're in New England in that period of time, you didn't get used to anything other than the type of success you were having. Right? And I think that's a difficulty with the next person going to Detroit. It's going to be something to be heard, or that should be heard, in any conversation in Jacksonville. I think it's a valid point of what you're doing in both Atlanta, and Houston, and then with Joe Douglas and being there with the Jets. If you haven't had a down slot, if you haven't had a hiccup at any point in time, and Quinn, not before Detroit, Matt Patricia, not before Detroit, and a lot of those variables, right? Caldwell, everything's going good. You were, a scout in Indianapolis, then you go to Atlanta, you get that pop of what success in Atlanta, and then you bump down there. If you've never had some of these issues come at you the way they are coming at you, and you've never had that bump in the road, and now you go to an organization that has felt nothing but bumps in the road, it is going to be really different to sit in that chair in Detroit, in Jacksonville, in the Jets, and sit there and say, okay, hey, now I'm the GM. All right, let's have a football meeting. Oh, wait a minute. Before I even get to that, I got the people at the gate, the fans are already storming the castle because they hired some other dude, that not the guy that they wanted. They want me to, I got coaches I got to fire and hire. I got a JJ Watt if I go take that job that I have to make a decision on. I got Matt Ryan's contract sitting on my desk day one. I'm in Jacksonville where the fan base hates the owner who just hired me because he takes home games and plays them in London. Yeah, welcome to the job you just accepted, which is totally different than sitting in New England, right? Or sitting in wherever that person is right now, right? Somebody who's been in Kansas City and all you've seen is, basically 30 weeks of a quarterback throwing for 500 yards and an offense scoring 38 points. Guess what? When you get to Jacksonville and you're averaging 15 points a game for the first month of your tenure as GM, that's a whole different ballgame. That's a lot different scenario. So I think if you've never had any kind of, different experiences, it's not just learning other things or having the adaptability to learn different things, because Bill Belichick took a lot of what happened in Cleveland, but he also left a lot of what happened in Cleveland. And then went there, right? Parcells able to figure out how to do this in all these different places was because some of it looks the same in all those places, but other parts were adjusted for where he was, right? And I think the Ryan Pace thing is a perfect example to look at and say, hey, when you look at the Bills and you look at the Bears and, you look at the, some of those organizations, realizing where you are and what your play style should be is different in all 32 organizations, right? If you try to be in LA and you tried to have a ground and pound defense and a game manager and you barely scored often we're not the highest scoring type team, you might win some games, but you're going to get heavily criticized because you're in that LA market and you don't have all the weapons. You're not looking like what they think pro football looks like. If you're in Chicago, right, I think, taking Trubisky, the issue there to me was almost the same as a Northeast team like the Bills when they went after Rob Johnson, right? How do you take a kid that's never been in that kind of atmosphere, never been in that kind of weather, never been asked to do those type of things, and all of a sudden you're going to take a cold weather team that has defense and needs toughness, and you're taking a guy that wants to play West Coast style offense, and you're going to put him in a system that didn't work for him. And here you have the other night, you're watching that game. At no time did you have any confidence that Trubisky was moving that team, right? At no time did you see there was anything going on there. And then I think you doubled down last night and you just see either you need to divorce Wentz from those coaches or you need to divorce those coaches from Wentz, because you've seen Carson
or all
Wentz,
of the above. How about all of the above?
right? Like you've seen Carson Wentz make plays in the past. Trubisky, you just have to kind of admit to the factor that if I'm Ryan Pace and I'm fighting for my job, I'm just saying, hey, it didn't work out. Don't beat around the bush. Don't try to tell me what could have happened. Hey, we had a good evaluation on him, but guess what? We couldn't evaluate here and here. And he doesn't have it here to make quick decisions, and he honestly doesn't have it here to be that guy. Now, could he do that in the future? We'll see, but it ain't happening in Chicago.
Yeah.
And I think that's some of the stuff is when you've never gone through bullets flying at you at that speed, that knocks out quarterbacks, but that also knocks out some coaches and some GMs because those bullets don't come flying at you as a coordinator, as a position coach, right? As the scouting, when you're scouting on the road. Those bullets that are flying, you don't even know they were flying at your GM unless he talks to you about it. So when you finally get into that chair, but you realize that most of what your day is going to be is the total opposite of what you came up doing, those bullets are flying at a lot faster speed than you're used to. And I think if you've never had speed bumps in your career prior to getting put in that type of situation, when they start coming at you from all sides, it can be probably a lot to handle and deal with. And that has nothing to do with the football part of it, right? It has literally nothing to do with the football part of it because you're getting things thrown at you from all directions. And if you need any better case scenario, go watch that, that last year with Hugh Jackson and Baker Mayfield and John Dorsey and Todd Haley and see that. You want to see what it looks like when the bullets start flying. That's what it looks like.
Well, I'm going to go back to, what you said about Bill Parcells too, because I think, there's a big segment of our listening audience now that is probably young enough to know the name, but don't really remember him on the sidelines. And he used to always tell that story. He went 3-12 his first season, and they were sitting, 500 halfway through his second year on the hot seat. They were ready to can him. And he said, hey, well, heck, he in New York now, you can't avoid the back pages there. You know what's going on. So he said, hey, if I'm going to go down, if this ship is going to sink, I'm going to do it my way at least, right? Because the first year and a half, he was trying to, appease everybody. And it took him, about 25 games to say, hey, you know what? I'm going to do it my way, and it's sink or swim. And as you know, the rest is history. But it's very valid that you've got to, face the adversity, deal with that kind of stuff. And you can't teach experience, right? I mean, listen, at the end of the day, you cannot teach situations. You cannot teach experience. And I think, you're kind of seeing that with some of the people here that are getting the axe at the NFL. Lots more pink slips to come.
Yep, but at the same time, it's important to point out that you don't have to have had tons of outside. I mean, you look at Buffalo right now. You look at Tennessee. Both their GMs basically grew up in one building. But the difference is the guys that are the head coaches who are sort of their partners have very different backgrounds.
Mm-hmm.
McDermott up in Buffalo, this is a guy who bounced around, got fired from some jobs. Vrabel was a guy who played in Pittsburgh, saw how the Steelers did things, saw how different they do things than when he played in New England, saw the different ways that was done, went down and coached in Houston for a while, saw what was going on there. So I think if you have a GM or a head coach who only grew up in one building, you want to make sure the person they're paired with, because really the GM and head coach have to be a pair. They have to work together regardless of who has the final say. One of them has to have that experience of doing different things so that you can adjust on the fly. And the other thing I'll throw out there is you mentioned Coach Morris down in Atlanta. And I've always heard good things about him as a coach and a motivator. The one thing I will always throw out there, and I think the Cleveland Browns fans will speak quickly to this, is be very cautious assigning credit to an interim head coach. Because when the head coach and GM in some instances are fired, the players know they have nothing. They're just playing for fun at that point. They're playing for next year. They're playing to make sure they have jobs somewhere else in the league. They're not playing to win games. They're playing to make themselves look the best. They understand they could be out on the street in 6 months. Whereas if that head coach had stayed, then they'd have a job. So they wouldn't always grind as hard. So sometimes when those head coaching changes happen and an interim guy comes in, the teams play at a higher intensity level the rest of the year because the players want to make sure they're employed. And I'm not saying Morris doesn't deserve a chance to interview or whatever because I'm not in that building. I don't see how it's going. I'm just saying you always have to be cautious with the interim guys because it's such a unique situation. Sure. And I can't honestly go back and look at many guys who were interim who got the head gig eventually who ended up having long, successful runs.
Well, here's one thing I want to throw out to you guys, and I know we're going a little OT here, but I'm curious if you guys have a take. How do you feel about Louis Riddick openly campaigning for the Eagles GM job last night?
You know, if it were me, and I don't want to say this, I've met Louis, I think once. We may have been introduced and shook hands once. If I were an owner and I got that impression from watching that game, I would cross him off the list. Not that you don't want a guy that's going to push for a job and be aggressive about having his people reach out, but publicly going on there, when you start pointing out all of a sudden you're saying, well, the last 6 years, they haven't had a player drafted that's made a Pro Bowl. It's like, A, one, is that really the right way to go about it? And B, more importantly, and Louis is a very smart guy. Everybody, we have mutual acquaintances. Everybody that I know that knows him says this is one of the most decent people and a very smart guy. He knows that Pro Bowls don't count towards how good a player is. He knows that there are a lot of players who never get to the Pro Bowl who are very good. So to me, that would be a red flag. If I'm an owner saying, the Pro Bowls, I always get told the Pro Bowls don't mean anything. So right. I don't know. I would just be very nervous about it. And then, like I said, I've never met the guy other than maybe one time. And everything I've heard about him has been positive. But I'd be very hesitant to that. That would make me very leery, especially when there's so many other people out there that, to me, have worked their way up, bouncing around, going team to team, even young guys. There's guys around the league that you don't have to follow the traditional path. I think who's the most successful coach outside of Belichick the last 20 years? It's Andy Reid. Andy Reid was never even a coordinator in the NFL. I mean, this guy was a quarterback coach. So maybe teams ought to say, let's look outside the box. Do we have to go get that director of scouting, director of player personnel, assistant GM to be our GM? Or should we go try to find a real smart leader who can be the guy who runs our franchise, who will surround himself with the people that may make up for his lack of expertise in specific areas, but he has the leadership capability to run a franchise?
No, and I tend to agree with you, Russ, because listen, we get it. You finished as the runner-up to Gettleman there. You almost had the Giants job. We get it. You want to be a GM. We all know that. But
and
man,
I understand it.
Yeah, but I just think the approach, and John, feel free to weigh in here. Just the approach that he took. I mean, obviously he came armed and prepared with the extra preparation.
I would tell you one thing. If that was my job, he'd be showing up next week with a shiner on ESPN. I'll tell you what, I'm straight up like Howie. If I'm Howie Roseman, I'm putting him back on blast because hey, straight up, it's real easy to be a GM on TV because I guarantee you, we can go back and find those resumes from what you and Daniel Jeremiah didn't do while you were in the NFL to explain why you had to end up on TV. So I think it's real easy when they hand you a mic and there's no wins and losses involved to be talking about what you could do. Well, why don't we go back and find out what you did do when you couldn't even handle the job you had? Right? So I think that arrow burns both ways, but here's the problem. You can't do it. Right? Here's the problem. Howie Roseman can't get up this morning and make that phone call. He can't walk down 2 spots in the press box, pull the mic out his phone at his hand last night, and give him one for good luck.
Not in 2020.
Not in 2020. Well, I mean, fired for a whole other reason. But I'm saying it is a lot easier to sit there and go that route than to do what others have done, who I would say are earning that opportunity differently, to say you got up to a certain level, and then when you had a choice to go back on the road or take a TV job, you took a TV job that requires you're not drafting anybody. You're only scouting to a degree. None of the picks you make on TV have to get signed by you after you make them. None of those decisions you talk about on Monday end up having any repercussions on the game the following week. So it's a lot easier to be the head of college scouting on ESPN or the GM on Monday Night Football when there are zero people and zero, consequences to anything you say other than your piss poor ratings.
And, the thing I'll add is, and there was a lot of criticism when John Lynch and when Mike Mayock got GM's jobs, and given their GM's jobs are like Nick Caesarea. They're not in charge. The head coach is in charge, but that's fine. Half the teams are like that, and that's part of football. It just works that way. But neither Mayock or Lynch, when you would listen to them, firstly, they were always positive. And you never saw them openly start ripping into specific drafts and stuff like that on the air. Now, during the draft coverage, obviously, Mike had to be critical of certain picks, but you never heard him start saying, hey, they haven't drafted this and they haven't drafted this. There's a way to go about it. And the other thing I'll say to give, because everybody's killing the Eagles, and I understand that they're disappointed there, but I will tell you, when their season began, and I always just go through rosters, just sort of get my scouting ready for grading NFL players that might get cut. Every year, and this year it was 100% there. When you go through the Eagles roster in the preseason, they have a lot of talent on that team. Now, you can say they're not playing well and they've had some injuries or whatever, but to say that they haven't found players, whether it's through the draft or undrafted free agents and free agency, and you look at some of the D linemen that they have. Vinny Curry barely even getting on the field when he was healthy. I mean, things like that. I mean, they've done a great job, in my opinion, of bringing in talent, of finding guys that maybe are on the street after other teams didn't need them. So, yeah, are they playing great football? Obviously not. And Carson, I personally think there's an injury that is not out there, because his inconsistency throwing the ball is something that's surprise. I have never seen a quarterback be that good for such a long stretch early in his career and then play so inconsistently. And he's not terrible. There were plays last night he made that were really good. And then he was missing wide open receivers. And that's what leads me to think, is there an injury we don't know about that he, of course, being the tough guy and the team player he is not commenting on? And the head coach and the GM, obviously being the smart people they are, they're not commenting on any injuries. They're just letting this play the way it is. So, I don't know. I just think the Eagles are getting a lot of undue criticism. I do think that they will get this figured out. Howie has built, in my opinion, an outstanding depth of roster, and I think next year they will be back playing good football.
Well, and you look at the bottom of the roster, the way they developed some of their players. I mean, they took Greg Ward, a college quarterback.
Yep.
You didn't even hear the guy's name for 2 years. Now they developed him into the number one receiver on the team.
Travis Fulgham.
Right?
I mean, they've done a great job. Boston Scott, another phenomenal job by them. They've done it, and even that Australian.
Jason Kelce was like a third or fourth round pick. He's a borderline Hall of Famer.
Yep, no doubt. That's why I people get on him, and trust me, they're not playing well, and I understand.
Alex Singleton, the Canadian, eh?
Yeah, there you go, from Calgary, no doubt. I mean, I think you just have to look at it, and I think. And we'll know after the season. We will know what if there is a belief by Jeffrey Lurie that there is no talent on the roster. I think we will see major changes. I think if Jeffrey believes a lot of this is due to injury and Carson struggling through a tough year, I don't think you'll see any real changes, and you will see them give it another shot next year, which is what I believe will happen and should happen in Philadelphia.
Yeah, and I think the division will still be wide open, and you kind of give, the Super Bowl honeymoon is still somewhat there. Give them the bye on the COVID season. I think that's how it will unfold, and I think they're all coming back for another season. And then if it doesn't work, well, then hey, then everybody's on alert. We're on overtime alert here on the State of Football. We had to go down that road and just bring it to you raw, bring it to you live, unfiltered here on the State of Football. It's what we do. Weekdays, 9 a.m. Eastern, your new home for real football talk in the morning. Of course, the Cyber Week promo code Familia50. Familia50 is valid for anything on the website. Take advantage of that. We appreciate it. It's time for parting shot, fellas. So we'll go over to Russ Lande, who also conducts the football GM and scouting course on Sports Management Worldwide. If you want more of Russ, he also has a weekly show with Matt Waldman now. So make sure you check that out. And those are some interesting conversations, Russ. So if you want to enlighten our listening audience on some of the things you got going on, what's cooking in your neck of the woods there in Chicago?
Well, just watching a lot of film, trying to find some players that want to come up north and help Calgary get back to winning when we actually didn't play this year, so nobody had a chance to win or lose. And it's interesting. We have our conversation here, and all of us have scouted for what seems like forever, and have similar backgrounds in terms of sort of media side, working into football and sort of doing that. The podcast I do with Matt is unique because Matt worked as a teacher. He was working, teaching, different jobs in a lot of different avenues before he started doing his football rookie scouting portfolio about 15 years ago. He comes to this with a very different perspective. So we get into discussions that go completely sideways when it comes to football. Really odd sort of discussions, always football related, but really different perspectives. And it's really interesting how, despite our coming from very different places, we have very different philosophy or very similar philosophies on football. So really interesting having those chats. And I got to tell you, each and every day, I'm just so thankful. I mean, John can attest to this, and you, Rick, is when you see all these people getting fired, people don't realize on the outside. They talk about, oh, fire Patricia, he's terrible. And yeah, maybe he's not a good coach. We don't know, or Quinn, and he's a bad GM. We don't know. But people forget that when a head coach and GM both get fired, you're probably talking between 35 to 45 families are going to have to pick up their life, move to another city. Probably 70 or 80 kids, that means they're going to have to get pulled out of school or pulled out of daycare, move to another city, leave all their friends. People don't realize getting rid of the head coach or the GM, it's not just one or two people that are affected. It affects hundreds of lives, livelihoods. Some of these coaches and scouts that get let go, they'll never get back into coaching or scouting in the NFL. It's a brutal business. It's very rough on the families. And just you feel bad anytime you see anybody get fired in this business. It's what's going to happen. It's just not fun. It's a side of football that's tough. I can tell you, and I think I've told Rick this story, but I was at the Rams for 4 years. I was a nobody. I knew very few people around the league personally because I was only in the office. So everything I did was via phone. When I got fired by the Rams, I got over 150 phone calls the next day from people I barely knew but had spoken to once or twice, saying, welcome to the NFL. You've now officially are a part of the league now that you've been fired. It's a brutal, brutal business. And anytime I hear anybody get excited or happy about people being fired, those are the people I write down their names and say, that's someone I'll never have work for my organization. Because in this business, you can never be happy when someone gets fired. Those are livelihoods lost. Don't get me wrong. We all know it's going to happen, but you don't cheer for it to happen.
Absolutely. Great perspective from Russ Lande. We always appreciate the point of view here each and every Tuesday, 9 a.m. Eastern. Make sure you keep it locked. Make sure you check out the Matt Waldman show. Very unique platform they have going on there. Of course, the football GM and scouting course on sportsmanagementworldwide.com. John, another hour of power. We'll be back tomorrow. I've got to reach out to Jeff Benedict, make sure he's good to go with the Dynasty Patriots book. We'll dive into that conversation. We've got other couple potential guests lined up, but what direction you want to go here today with our parting shots?
Well, I guess we'll find out exactly if we are having an NFL game on Wednesday. Every day it seems it gets pushed back. So we didn't think we'd have a Thursday night game. We might have a Thursday night game after all, which would have been the game that was supposed to be played last Thursday, could now be played closer to this Thursday, as we go for it. But, hopefully, some of the things that are going on there with the Ravens have settled down, right? You saw, I think the news was that Mark Ingram and J.K. Dobbins would be able to play. So at least a few of the guys, a few of the things there are starting to settle down. And, hopefully the same will be for the Steelers, and we can kind of get away from it. We've also heard that today, if Ohio State does play Michigan State on time on Saturday, they will do so without head coach Ryan Day. So he would not be able to coach in that game and be there live. So second consecutive week that a top 3 team in the country would be playing a game, without their head coach. So again, every day we try to get away from how COVID has affected football, and every day it drags us right kind of back in, to that. And on the flip side of coming off of what Russ just said, it made me realize yesterday was the 6th anniversary of the Stampeders winning the Grey Cup in 2014. So I definitely remember what that Monday, today, day after the Grey Cup, was like, waking up, getting on the plane, flying home, taking the bus, and then seeing how many of the thousands of fans stood out in the snow, to welcome their team home. So just another thing, realizing that no team got to kind of experience the high of getting on the plane with your teammates the next day. Remember Huff had the Grey Cup sitting up next to him on the front seat, and I had the 2 girls at that time, very little, kind of sitting on the team plane ride home instead of sitting in the back with the families. They sat up front, with us on the flight home. And on the flip side, we lost a playoff game just about 2 years ago, right now, to Winnipeg in Saskatchewan, and I was sitting there on this date and tomorrow, kind of being told forced, significant pay cut if you want to keep your job. So December 3rd, 2 years ago, literally just a couple of weeks after hosting a home playoff game, you had to make a decision on what you were going to do and not really know where things would go next. So I think, again, what Russ finished saying there, guys can succeed or not succeed in the job, that they were given. That might be your favorite team, but don't forget, when they don't succeed for your favorite team, they're also letting down their favorite team, which is the people that are at home, right? So that's not only a loss of your job, but that's also going home and facing the factor that, you're telling all those people all of these subsequent moves that are going to happen. You're walking in there and not giving it a choice. You're pulling your family, out of their comfort zone. So then a lot of that kind of circles around a second time. What didn't go right or how it didn't go right for you kind of comes back around and circles a second and sometimes third time, in terms of having to make all those decisions and, end up back in a different city or end up in a different place. And it will never be easy for any of those guys to have to, at some point, if they do have to, make that long trek back to New England. I'll say that part for sure. That would be a very unenviable scenario to end up having left them on the highest point and now having to come back knowing that, well, hey, maybe I can't be a head coach, or maybe I'm not made for GM, or whatever. And there'll be another time to tell longer stories, but I'll leave it with this. The guy Russ is working for right now is the number one person that I've ever interacted with in terms of showing you what kind of person and what kind of character they have in the business, in terms of no matter what else has gone on, good or bad. That's always been the first person making a phone call to me the day after, and that's Coach Huffnagel.
Can't end it any better than that, folks. The football business is a roller coaster ride. We take you on all the highs and lows and everything in between here on the State of Football. Again, weekdays, 9 a.m. Eastern. Your new